So what I'm going to look at today is primarily focusing on 3 different models for understanding how we might be able to move ahead, especially in Canada, to address health inequalities. So the three models of policy change that I'm going to look at are pluralism, policy paradigms, and political economy. And I want to look at their insights to see how they might help us, depending on where we are in the world. So just to look briefly at the state of social policy in Canada, I'm sure that you've already discussed this in other sessions. I would describe the situation in Canada as being particularly wanting. We are a liberal welfare state, as many presenters have already acknowledged, and we tend to have a discourse that focuses on health care. And there's little discussion beyond that to look at health inequalities and what we can actually do about them. And there's fundamentally a lack of political will to really take action to address the health inequalities that we have in Canada. And what we do see more in Canada and also in the US and the other liberal welfare states for that matter is this very individualized approach, that it's an individual's responsibility to make sure that they're healthy, and anything that happens in their lives is their responsibility. So the state has no role in all of this, so they say. And Canada, together with Germany, was identified as having one of the biggest increases in inequalities among rich countries in the world. Although I understand Germany is a little bit higher, we're not doing much better. Our situation is worsening, as many of the statistics that Dennis presented has shown. And I just want to look briefly at the Gini coefficient, and this is some fairly recent data from an OECD document for 2010. And our Gini coefficient is well below the OECD average. We're at about 0.32, so that's not very good. And if you see where the Scandinavian countries in particular, Norway, Denmark, and the other Scandinavian countries, they tend to be much lower. So we're not doing very well in terms of addressing inequalities. Why is this happening? Well, some of the influences have already been identified. Certainly, federalism has a very critical role. The institutions that we have in Canada do tend to obstruct certain issues and certain perspectives from being presented. And I would argue that probably the central problem is neoliberalism, which has really taken hold here in Canada and in other countries. As a result of that, we've seen a declining influence of the federal government. There's much decentralization going on to the provinces. And the provinces are quite variable in the degree to which they are willing to address inequalities. And finally, if you look at our political system as a whole, the electoral system, it's very hard for small parties such as, well, the NDP is now the official opposition, but that happened for the first time in 2011. But it's traditionally or historically been difficult for the NDP and the Green Party and other small parties to have any kind of influence on the political process. And it would seem that when we have a minority government in Canada, that seems to be an opportunity for these smaller parties to have some influence. And it has been recognized around the world, especially by the World Health Organization, that we do have inequalities, not because they're inevitable somehow, but they happen because of the public policies that are in place. And this is why we need to direct our attention to public policies and what influences them, and therefore produce policies that are going to address inequalities. Now, this is just for your amusement. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on. I'm sure many of you have seen this particular cartoon. And I'm just going to spend a moment on this. Dennis has already elaborated on this particular display, which I find very useful in terms of understanding what each of the different types of welfare regimes really represents. The only thing I want to add about liberal welfare states is that I tend to describe it to my students as being about freedom from government. This was something I read about 20 years ago in a text by 2 British political economists. And I would say that it's probably really captures the essence of a liberal welfare state, especially here in Canada, that there's this belief that if government is involved, then it's bad. Whereas I tend to say to my students that government is there to ensure equity. When government intervenes, it's a way of ensuring that everybody has access to services and programs that they need in order to have a decent quality of life. So that's all I will say about that. Now I just want to get into the policy change models themselves and discuss what they can tell us. Now, pluralism is one I chose because it does tend to be the dominant policy analysis approach that we see in North America. And in fact, a lot of interest groups, those working on poverty, for example, tend to draw on this model, and it may be because it seems to present government as being part of the solution, and maybe they think this helps them. But in the end, it's a very consensus model. The notion is that people can bring their ideas, government will listen, and provided they're good ideas, then they will be taken into account while government decides what to do about a given issue. So there's a very strong emphasis on ideas and certainly on evidence, and I think certain kinds of evidence in this particular model. But it has not really developed an understanding or some kind of conceptualization of inequality and what that means. There is an assumption built into the model, it's embedded in the model, that everybody has access to the political process, that they should experience no difficulty. We have seen in Ontario, certainly under the Mike Harris government back in the mid-1990s, that not all citizens have the same access to government. In fact, there seemed to be a filtering process where certain perspectives, especially those who disagreed with the government, were screened out. And I think we continue to see this under the Harper government federally, and to some degree in Ontario still. But the model seems to convey this image of a benevolent state, that it's only doing what is best for the collective, and I'm not sure that that is always the case. There's also this emphasis on you can bring whatever ideas that you want, and we will assess those ideas based on their merit. So I'm going to move on to the next model, which is policy paradigms, which was devised by Peter Hall at Harvard University. The interesting thing about this model is that it provides a fairly useful typology of different types of policy change. The first, of course, is first order policy change, which is focused on policy setting. So it might mean, for example, indexing pensions to inflation, or deciding that they want to increase the number of schools or community health centers in communities across a province, for example. The next one is second order change, and this usually involves just changing the instruments that are being used to bring about certain change. And the best example I can give you is around smoking cessation. If they decide that people aren't simply going to do it by responding to various advertisements that the government posts saying that smoking is bad for you, then they might decide, okay, then we have to hit them in the pocketbook, so we're going to use something that's more involuntary. We'll fine them, or we'll tax them more heavily to make them stop smoking, or make them think more seriously about stopping. And finally, and the reason for this model was developing some kind of means for understanding radical policy change. So he refers to this as paradigmatic or radical policy change. So this would be, say, a shift from a biomedical approach to health to social determinants, much as they've done in the Scandinavian countries, less so here. But it involves a dramatic shift in the overall policy goals and objectives, and sometimes in the policy implementation or instruments themselves. The model itself is a very rational one. It's focused on ideas, similar to pluralism. There is some acknowledgement that there is conflict, and it usually revolves around these paradigms, as he defines them. These are the realms in which policymakers do what they do, and the ideas that shape what they do. And they're almost taken for granted. So they don't really think about them, but this is the world in which they operate. And as the anomalies accumulate for the received paradigm, in our case now it seems to be the welfare state, as Margaret Thatcher did in Britain, that there was much concern about Keynesian welfare state, that it wasn't achieving what it should be, and this helped her bring in more of a monetarist or neoliberal approach to public policy. So we saw her peeling away at the British welfare state, and we've seen that happen in other countries as well. So in her case, or in Britain's case, the new paradigm was monetarism. So again, similar to pluralism, it's based on ideas. It's concerned with the role of experts and what impact they can have on policy. I found that Hall tends to be a little less concerned about the close relationship between experts and policy advisors, or politicians themselves. There's little consideration in his model about other sectors, such as maybe the labor sector or citizen movements, in trying to change policy. And finally, the last one I wanted to look at is political economy, which is more of a materialist approach to politics and political processes. It is concerned with redistribution. It's especially concerned with the role of the market and political ideology. So again, it seems to start from that premise that what we see is, or what happens in countries is not inevitable, that there are public policies that tend to bring these conditions about. And the model also sees politics and economics as being fundamentally related to one another and shaping policy outcomes and living conditions as a whole. And these interact with social locations, gender, social class, race, all of the ascriptive characteristics. And I personally prefer this particular model because it does take strongly into account the role of neoliberalism and the exercise of political power. It's also very compatible with the social determinants perspective. And furthermore, what I like is what Dennis was emphasizing, that it's a model that looks at who's benefiting from this, who isn't benefiting, but also who is making money from this, who is profiting from poverty, for example. And moreover, what can we do about it? How can we move ahead? And there does tend to be more of a focus in the model on inequalities and how these come about, but also what can we do about them. Now, I devised these you can collect this in a handout at the back. It was to look at each of the countries, groups of countries that we were profiling in this particular book that Dennis edited, looking at the lessons for Canada, essentially. But I broke this down by looking at each of these political or policy change models to see what insights would they bring to each of these countries and where they're at in terms of addressing health inequalities. So for the Scandinavian countries, for example, it might be fine to use a pluralist lens to understand what they need to do differently. In some cases, inequalities has been off the agenda, but because it's been on the national public policy agenda, it will be easy to bring it back on. Perhaps some public education would help. This would less so be the case in Canada and the other liberal welfare states. Public education will not be enough. That is not going to be enough to bring about action. So I'm going to draw your attention to the box on political economy, because I think that's what we really need here to understand the forces that are at play and how we can start to address health inequalities. And we have to do something to try to strengthen the labor movements, anti-poverty movement, and other groups that are essentially working on these issues, but bring them together and try to bring about action by government. So here we have never had health inequalities on the public policy agenda. We've had promises from the federal NDP that yes, they will address them, but we still have to get it on the agenda. There has to be some serious talk and some serious proposals on the table. So I'm going to entrust this to you to look at, and I'm going to skip this in the sake of time. How much more time do I have? A few minutes? 12. And I'll just go through. I'll just go to the next one. I'm
sorry, you're
8 minutes. Okay. This is the book that I'm talking about, Tackling Health Inequalities. And my chapter actually looks at, across the different countries that we examine in this text and look at what can we learn from them, but how can we move forward. So I'll leave that to you. Thank you for your time.